Welcome to Andy Staples on 3. Happy NFL Draft Week. That is going to dominate the conversation pretty much everywhere, but also it's going to dominate a lot of the conversation here as we say goodbye to some of our favorite college football players, wish them well in the NFL, and get mad when NFL teams don't value our favorite college football players as much as we do. But today, we're going to take a trip down memory lane. We're going to talk about these guys that we are now talking about as potential first rounders. Like a lot of the guys whose names you are going to hear called on Thursday night. We're going to talk about them as recruits and how they got to their schools, how they, well, in certain cases, moved from one school to another. And it's fascinating. It's fascinating to think about young Brock Bowers coming out of Napa, California, J.J. McCarthy, who wanted to go to Ohio State, but they took Kyle McCord and he wound up at Michigan. Jayden Daniels, who started his career at Arizona State, wound up at LSU. So many stories and so many steps on the path to getting your name called Thursday and going and hugging Roger Goodell. But I thought, let's talk to the guys whose job it is to evaluate these guys coming out of high school, because they have an even tougher job than the NFL scouts have, because the NFL scouts, they're working from a much smaller pool. Yes, they're investing more money, but they've got a little narrower focus. And so it's a little bit easier. And you're also dealing with people who are 21, 22, 23 years old. You don't have to worry about what's going to happen at the end of puberty. Like, are they going to stop growing? Are they going to keep growing? This is something that college football coaches have to worry about all the time. And so we're going to talk to Charles Power, who's our director of ranking here at On3, who's been scouting and ranking recruits for years, and also Cody Bellaire, who worked, as you heard last week, in multiple personnel departments at different colleges and had to be on the ground watching these guys as they came out of high school and be in those meetings where the college coaches were like, okay, this guy, yes, this guy, no. And he's got a ton of stories about, hey, we liked this guy, but we couldn't get him, or we weren't quite sure on this guy, and look at what he became. It's a fascinating process. We love in the draft. You're going to get this stat in the draft about how many guys were 3 stars or 2 stars or no stars. Well, yeah, because there's 32 5-stars a year. Well, guess what? A lot of those 5 stars are going to be first-round draft picks. But, yeah, they're going to be guys who come out of the woodwork, like Jared Verse at Florida State. He started his career at Albany as a tight end. He put on 40 pounds of muscle during COVID working out by himself and became a completely different player. We love those stories at draft time too. But the intrigue of the recruits at the top and why this guy was ranked higher than this guy, and this guy was ranked higher, it's absolutely fascinating. So let's talk NFL draft and the guys who are going to be called in the first round back when they were in high school with Charles Power and Cody Bellaire. We are going to have a very fun roundtable here. We're talking NFL draft, but this is on 3. So, of course, we're going to talk about it from a recruiting and evaluation perspective, because they're trying to see, how are we doing here? We getting this stuff right? Cody Bellaire, national scout. Charles Power, director of ranking and scouting. We are a few days away from this NFL draft, trying to figure out where these guys are going to go. But Charles, we were just talking about this before we started recording. This is a weird year in terms of evaluations. When these guys were coming out of high school, these guys were high school senior, like your 3-and-out guys, which is a lot of the guys who are going to be drafted in this first round. 3-and-out guys were seniors in 2020 in the midst of the pandemic.
Yeah. It was, I think back on that year, and it was certainly the most challenging and just different cycle that I've had to evaluate in my years of doing this. Like if you didn't see a guy before March of 2020, you just did not see them in person the whole year. And that goes not just for us, but for colleges. Colleges couldn't have any prospects on campus. And they were kind of you're going strictly off of film. You're trying to track down measurables. And several of those prospects had their senior seasons canceled. So you didn't have not only the in-person evaluation point, but for many of them, you didn't see them play football or any sport for, the better part of 8 months plus into them enrolling. So just from my time of doing this, is probably the biggest guessing game and just lack of substantive kind of information and data points and just source material that you had to use to evaluate. So it's really kind of fascinating to see how this is all played out.
So Cody, it's interesting though, because I look at the 2021 industry rankings and I see a lot of the names that we're seeing in the mock drafts. Like, so we decided for this exercise, we're going to use Daniel Jeremiah's mock draft. And I believe there's 7 names from the top 50 of the industry rankings in this one. So like JC Latham was number 3, the Alabama offensive tackle. Caleb Williams was number 7. Dallas Turner was number 9. These are all people we expect to see drafted very high in this draft. So is it just a case of like when you see Caleb Williams in high school, you're like, oh God, that guy's so much better than everybody else?
To some degree, yes. To some degree. And I think Charles made a great point. A lot with the COVID year, it threw off a lot of teams' processes, right? Because so much of the work that goes into these offices and these teams on the evaluation side is seeing the kids in person, right? There's a serious value to that. And ironically, I think what COVID did during this process to teams and programs across the country, it sort of forced them to rely on their evaluation skills, right? I think a lot of people take for granted the ability to watch tape and say, okay, we see these skills on tape. How do those translate to us at the collegiate level? And I think sometimes in the in-person eval it sort of tricks you, right? You have times where you sort of say, oh, maybe this kid's smaller than I actually thought he was on tape. Maybe I'm actually going to discredit all the things I'm seeing on the high school tape, and I don't know if that's going to translate to the next level. Well, during COVID, you sort of had to trust yourself and you had to trust the tape. So I think ironically, it was the inverse effect where more teams had to sort of trust what they saw on film and hope that it translated to the next level.
Well, let's start at the top. Let's talk about Caleb Williams, because I got to tell you, for me, I decided Caleb Williams was the number 1 pick in this draft. I think probably when he went into the Texas game as a freshman and saved Oklahoma's bacon, but I was positive, damn sure he was the number 1 pick in this draft during the Kansas game. That, remember the play where he throws it to the guy, he runs to, like, steals the ball back from him.
Ridiculous.
And is like, I'll take, like, nobody has those instincts or that improv. Like, and I think it ended up being a terrible play. He might have fumbled or something, but when he did it, I was like, oh God, this guy's so different.
Yeah. I think it was a really interesting quarterback cycle that year. A lot of guys committed early. We can kind of circle back on this when we're talking about like JJ McCarthy because Drake Maye.
Yeah.
But I remember, watching. We had just finished our 2020 ranking. I was at 24/7 at the time, and we had just finished our 2020 ranking. I was kind of starting to do like a deep dive on the 2021 quarterbacks. It was like a Saturday in February, and didn't have anything to do, and so I just watched a bunch of Caleb Williams stuff. And I came out, I was like, this guy's like clearly the best quarterback. It was just in terms of this the horsepower he had in his arm, his movement skills. I think in like if you just were to watch his highlights now, but like when I was doing this, I was watching full games, and it was like it translated to the game as well. But like I think in like a 3.5 minute highlight, he broke like 25 tackles. I mean, he was extremely difficult to tackle, awesome contact balance, and then just the ability to make throws from every platform. A lot of the throws that we saw him make at USC, like the rolling out throws that kind of went viral where he was throwing across his body, he was doing that in high school, like the exact same throws. So everything he was doing was just highly translatable. And I think there was an inclination for people to look at his stats and kind of ding him a little bit. But when you watch the film, you would see that there were no layups in their offense in high school. He was playing against really good competition. And I think when you watched it in the context of a game, I just came away every time thinking this guy's like uber talented. And it was a deal where, I thought he was clearly the top quarterback talent in the cycle. And even when like Quinn Ewers reclassified, like that to me just wasn't a question. I still would take Caleb Williams over him in terms of, especially after I saw Quinn physically, it just a different level. And it just so much potential and ability. And it's interesting. Like we would always kind of debate on like what his comp was in high school. And it's a lot of people said Mahomes and people said Russell Wilson. And you've kind of seen that come back around on Aaron Rodgers. And I think that's a really good one, but he certainly is that level of talent. And I just think like there's not a lot of guys that have come through high school football the last several cycles that have the combination of like arm talent, ability to play inside structure, which he really did more in high school than college. Like he was under center a good bit in high school, and then improvisational plays too.
Yeah, dude, Charles, I remember when we basically went back and we kind of do little projects, right, where you go back and watch tape, because we haven't watched Caleb, or at least I haven't watched Caleb since I was at Baylor in 21. Basically, I hadn't watched Caleb Williams. It takes about 4 plays before you got to pick your jaw back off the floor. I mean, he's got serious wow plays. It's probably 4 or 5 clips in. And so when I watched, I went 4 or 5 clips in, and I remember being like, God, I think LSU almost had him at one point. So I called one of my buddies at LSU that was there at the time, and he was like, oh, we were in it. Like because you got to remember, LSU was coming off a national championship 2019, because most of these quarterbacks, like Charles mentioned, they commit that season before their senior year as juniors. And so I called him up and I was like, dude, what happened? Like, how did y'all choke this? Like, what happened? And he was like, Joe Brady left. That's that same cycle where Joe Brady, the offensive coordinator, left January of 2020 to be the OC for the Carolina Panthers and Matt Rule. Lincoln Riley swoops in that summer. They get him committed, done deal, case closed. And that's how fast things can happen at that level.
Brock Vandagriff was at Oklahoma, and he flipped to open up the spot for Caleb Williams. So Caleb Williams' top 3 was like OU, which he basically like the story is he kind of recruited himself to Lincoln Riley. I think he was maybe talking to Lincoln Riley even while Brock was committed.
Crazy.
And then LSU and Maryland. So there's just like a bunch of sliding doors there.
Can you imagine? Well, okay, let's ask this question. Like, since Cody opened the sliding door here,
apology.
Is Ed Orgeron still the coach at LSU if Caleb Williams goes to LSU?
Guys, even more important, is Cody Bellaire still at LSU, or is he at On3? No one knows at this point. But yeah, I mean, that would be crazy. I mean, I will say at that time, we felt like the writing was on the wall. But I mean, to your point, if Caleb Williams there, is that a team that instead of going 7-5 goes, I don't know, 10-2, and we're still there? It's a great question, Andy. I don't know.
Oh my God, that is wild. All right. Well, since we've opened the Pandora's box of the quarterbacks, and everybody thinks it's going to be 1, 2, 3, and maybe 1, 2, 3, 4 quarterbacks. Let's go, because 3 of these guys were in the same class. And none of them were the highest ranked quarterback in the class because of a gentleman that Charles mentioned a few minutes earlier, Quinn Ewers. When he reclassified, he became the number 1 QB in this class. So let's move to Drake Maye. Drake Maye was committed to Alabama initially, probably best known to a casual college sports fan as the younger brother of Luke Maye, who was a star at North Carolina. If you're a North Carolina fan, obviously you know Dad played football at North Carolina. But Charles, what was the story on Drake Maye coming out of high school?
Yeah, Drake Maye was a really interesting prospect. He's probably of that group of quarterbacks. I saw Drake Maye in person the most. I actually got to see him at a 7-on-7 tournament right before the shutdown, and to this day, it probably is the best 7-on-7 performance I've seen from a quarterback. Like the ball just didn't hit the ground the whole weekend. But multi-sport athlete. I think among these quarterbacks, certainly the least trained of them. I just spent a lot of time playing basketball. I remember seeing him at a camp as a sophomore, and he was rough around the edges mechanically. And I still think that's probably an area where when you hear a lot of the draft discourse with Drake Maye, a lot of it is just mechanics. But you put him on the field, he's a baller. Like, there's just no doubt about it. He was the most efficient passer in high school football as a junior, both including the senior class. So that's including guys like Bryce Young, CJ Stroud. Drake Maye was more efficient than them. I think he threw 50 touchdowns and 2 interceptions. Just really, really accurate, and had a great feel for just playing just within a live, open environment, like great spatial awareness. And I think was certainly a better athlete than you would have thought just from watching his high school football film. He didn't run around a ton because he was just didn't have to. But then you watch him play high school basketball, and he was the guy who certainly had college level high school ability in basketball. Like I went back and like kind of into the vault. I probably will tweet it out this week, but just watching some of his basketball stuff, just really strong, like shooting mechanics. Just there's a lot of things that when you look at quarterbacks tend to translate well. Just the ability to replicate his motion and spatial awareness. So he was one that I think, in tying it back into the recruiting angle of this, I think if you were probably going to take a poll of college staffs when these 2021 quarterbacks started to come off the board, there was certainly no consensus, I would say, but I think Drake Maye probably was held in the highest regard among college staffs. I think he was, thinking back to that time, I think he was at the top of the board in a take for the majority of the schools that he was, kind of interested in, like your big national programs.
So when he flipped from Alabama, obviously he's a legacy at UNC. That was not entirely surprising. But now I'm trying to think about, again, with the sliding doors, like what if he goes to Alabama? He's the backup to Bryce Young. We probably don't see Drake Maye starting until this year, or maybe he would have hit the portal and gone somewhere. But we probably would have seen Drake Maye start this year instead of Jalen Milroe.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. And then who knows? Does Alabama win a national title?
I think it's, nowadays it's hard to assume a guy's going to stay that long. But yeah, no, it's certainly an interesting thing to think about. And he was a guy that, Nick Saban definitely loved Drake Maye. There's no doubt about it. He was a guy that everybody in that program was really excited about.
Cody, I want to bring Quinn Ewers back into the discussion, because obviously he's a guy we'll talk about a ton on the college side this year. He's the starter at Texas again. They're coming off a playoff berth. But this is a guy who, when he reclassified because the state of Texas was not going to allow high school athletes to take advantage of NIL deals. There was some kombucha money on the table. So he reclassifies, goes to Ohio State. What was it about Quinn Ewers that put him above Caleb Williams, Drake Maye, JJ McCarthy in that class?
Sure. Yeah, I think it goes to the arm talent, right? There's certain things you can't teach at the quarterback position, and it's truly in the juice of the arm, right? Like, there's certain throws that you have to make at the NFL level, and especially in the windows, right? That's always the thing that I think you hear teams talk about and you hear coaches talk about in these meetings in these buildings, is you have to be able to make the tight window throws, and you have to be able to drive the ball at every level of the field. And I think there's certain things that Quinn Ewers was able to show at his time in high school that even at an early age, right? He is older for that class. So physically, he is ready. He was physically ready, and it technically should have been a senior in that class. So that reclassification technically got him lined up with his peers from an age perspective. So it's not like this was a young kid that still needed to really physically grow into his frame and all that stuff. No, he was already there. And from an arm talent perspective, he was as good as anyone in the country. I think Caleb Williams was elite. I think Quinn Ewers is right behind him from an arm talent perspective. And that's just something coaches can't teach. So you have to value that. And that's something that I think Quinn Ewers was able to show, especially now as he's getting more comfortable with the offense. I think that's something you simply can't teach.
Charles, let's talk JJ McCarthy, because I am fascinated, because the JJ McCarthy situation affects multiple potential top 10 picks here, and one of the wildest transfer portal stories of this year. So let me recap, and then we'll get into what he was as a recruit, because JJ McCarthy really wanted to go to Ohio State. He wanted to be Ohio State's quarterback. They end up taking Kyle McCord instead. And the reason Kyle McCord was the take, really, that was the guy they liked. But that the bonus of that is you get his favorite high school receiver, Marvin Harrison Jr.
Yeah. JJ McCarthy, it's so funny thinking back to just, he was a polarizing guy really from the beginning to right now. And I think, I don't know if I've like struggled with a prospect from like high school to college more than JJ McCarthy. So just to kind of rewind it back. So we were coming out with our early rankings for this cycle post, sophomore year. And I thought that JJ McCarthy had the best sophomore year of any quarterback in 2021. He led his team to a state title, showed good arm talent, very productive, could run around and make plays, tough. I think he played a state championship game with like a broken hand. So I think I want to say we had him ranked as like maybe the top quarterback in the country as a sophomore. And it was really interesting. Like a lot of the feedback we got was like, I can't believe you'll have this guy this high. He's not at the top of college boards. He's small. Notre Dame, thinking back to then, Notre Dame was another program that I think he would have liked to go to, or was certainly had a lot of interest in. And they took Tyler Buckner, who had not played a varsity snap, maybe played one varsity snap. So he's one that I think initially, like the recruiting media was higher on him than college coaches. And then, he had an interesting, like kind of the rest of his high school career. His sophomore year was probably his best season, but played pretty well as a junior. And then of course, like Illinois canceled football what would be his senior year because of COVID. So he transferred down to IMG. And I think it was a tougher adjustment. Like he didn't throw any interceptions and he kind of managed the game, but there were certainly times just from me watching those games where he was swimming a little bit. And just from a rankings perspective, I think looking back, I mean, I definitely regret, I probably banged him a little too hard for that, but there still, I think, were some signs of questions that he has going into just the draft process. I mean, he's, just a relative unknown with the amount of passing attempts and just how little he was kind of leaned on at Michigan. But I just think back at the total arc of the JJ McCarthy experience. And he was a guy who really from sophomore year, opinions were split. So I think he's a guy that if you like him, you can certainly find a reason to like him. And if he's not your flavor, you can certainly find reasons for pause.
Well, and that's when so on Monday, I'm looking and seeing that there's odds now that he's going to be the second person off the board on Thursday night. And it's like, Cody, I don't know where it came from on the NFL side, but like hearing Charles talk about it, it makes more sense. I kind of wonder if our NFL front office is having these same debates that college ones did.
Absolutely. I mean, 100%. And I think to Charles's point, he lays it out perfectly in the sense that it's a flavors deal, right? Different offices want to do different things. And I think the debate, right? I think, Andy, to your point, I think it was Jayden Daniels was sort of the favorite at 2, and now it's sort of slid back to JJ McCarthy. And Jayden Daniels brings a totally different flavor with his game compared to JJ McCarthy. It's just simply, to your point, Andy, it's about what teams want to do. And when you go through this whole process, and I think off-field wise, I think Jayden is going to give you a lot of good answers and do the same thing. He's going to give you a lot of the answers that you want to hear. I think JJ is going to do a lot of the same things. But when you turn that tape on, it's completely different players. And you're talking about Jayden Daniels, whose offense was throwing the ball however many times a game. He carried the ball however many times a game. To Charles's point, JJ's still sort of an unknown. So I think what teams are doing, they're looking at the tools that JJ McCarthy brings with his arm and his ability to process. And I think they're comparing that to Jayden Daniels. And for some people, they're projecting JJ ceiling to be higher than maybe Jayden Daniels' ceiling. And those are conversations that are happening amongst all 32 teams.
Yeah, and Jayden Daniels is a fifth-year guy. And we're not used to that with Joe Burrow was a fifth-year guy who winds up being a number 1 overall pick, but we don't see it all that often. But Charles, I remember Jayden Daniels coming out of Southern California as a freshman at Arizona State. Everybody was pretty excited about him. What was he like as a prospect?
I mean, he was, I think, so if you think back to the 2019 cycle, the early narrative in that cycle was this is an awful year at quarterback. That's just what that was like being written about nationally. These teams are like, maybe like outside of Spencer Rattler, there's no real national types of quarterbacks. And the longer that cycle went on, I just became a really big fan of Jayden Daniels. He was by far the most productive quarterback in that cycle. And I think when you just look at it, if you just wrote out the Jayden Daniels case on paper, he really probably should have been the top quarterback in that cycle. And I think that's kind of the way it's shaken out. Just super, super elite production. He had over 4,500 passing yards, 60 touchdowns as a senior, 4 interceptions, ran for 1,500 yards, 16 touchdowns. So I think I compared him to Deshaun Watson out of high school, and there was very similar types of profiles and I think kind of overall skill sets there, just with them being such high usage and so productive. And also just being a very good athlete. I think the biggest concern with him was just that he was thin. And it kind of had like a low-key recruitment. Like he was mainly dealing kind of with the West Coast schools. I think his final 3 or kind of the main finalists were Arizona State, Utah, and UCLA. And he waited a little longer. So he just wasn't really kind of viewed as like this big national like headline recruit. When you looked at it from a talent perspective, he really was. So I thought there were so many great signs with him as a high school player, just given the kind of gaudy numbers he was putting up. And I thought like back then he probably should have been like the Gatorade National Player of the Year. And I'm not even sure he was the Player of the Year in California. He was just a guy who he just didn't get the headlines he deserved, I thought.
So you were working at 24/7 at the time. And it's interesting because these are the rankings you guys had for the quarterbacks for that year. Spencer Rattler was number 1, which I think was kind of the consensus across the industry. You had Jayden Daniels 2, Bo Nix 3, Sam Howell 4, Max Duggan 5. So your top 5, Spencer Rattler's going to get drafted. Has sneaky arm talent, or not sneaky, everybody knows his arm talent, but may end up being a good NFL quarterback. We'll see. Jayden Daniels is going to be a first-round pick. Bo Nix, maybe a second-round pick. Sam Howell's been a starter in the NFL for a year. He's been in the NFL for 2 years. And Max Duggan took his team to a national title game. That's a pretty damn good group.
Yeah, and honestly, too, I felt good. I felt better about that group. It's one thing. It's a good lesson when people say a cycle's down. It rarely is as bad as it seems. You just kind of got to go find the guys. But I remember back then as well, Andy, I think 4 of those, everybody but Rattler in that top group was starting as freshmen. So pretty instant kind of feedback on them. And I don't we didn't have that many quarterbacks starting as freshmen last year. It was fairly rare in college football. I think it's just kind of the programs that those guys ended up going to. But with Jayden Daniels, I mean, and this is all pre-transfer portal as well, right? So I think that's one benefit of the portal. Is you kind of give these guys avenues to kind of find success. You think about Bo Nix and kind of what he did to turn around his career transferring to Oregon, and then of course Jayden Daniels. But yeah, I think it turned out not to be as bad as once feared in the 2019
Well, and another thing, so Bo Nix, Michael Penix Jr., who Michael Penix Jr. is a class of 2018, was originally committed to Butch Jones at Tennessee. And when that staff got fired, the Pruitt staff cut him loose. But, without the COVID year, Jayden Daniels finishes his college eligibility after 2022, and we don't ever see that Heisman season. Bo Nix has a pretty good year as the first-year starter at Oregon, but we don't see that second year. We don't see Michael Penix take his team to the national title game. So I do wonder if that extra year, Spencer Rattler, doesn't get another year at South Carolina. I wonder how much that changed these guys' fortunes in terms of what they can be in the NFL.
Yeah, and to that point, Andy, the innovation, right? Because like you said, especially when Michael Penix, in 2018, the college landscape is completely different, but so is the technology, and there's things that's going into. We talked about programs last week, Andy, in terms of programs that sort of change how these personnel offices operate and stuff. You fast forward now, I talked to some of my guys at LSU. what was the big switch, right? Like what happened with Jayden after the transfer that sort of turned him into this guy that we know or talking about now as a potential top 5 pick? And this is somebody whose first season as the starter was solid. You know what I mean? He threw for nearly 3,000 yards. They went 10 and 4.
Ayuk will do that for you.
Right, no doubt.
Talk about at LSU.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm talking about his
right?
first season at Arizona State.
Sure. So what happens when, that offseason between year 1 and year 2 at LSU? And they said it was just preparation and his commitment to learning that offense and connecting with his teammates that allowed him to reach that new level, right? First player in the building, last guy to leave. Any chance he could get to throw to those guys, he would. But he really committed to learning that offense backwards and forwards. And I'll give a hat tip to the performance innovation department at LSU. That's headed by Jack Marucci. Yes, that Marucci that makes the bats. And Mario Macaluso over there.
Their longtime trainer who moved into the innovation department. Yeah.
Correct. When I was there, that's where he was at. And so now that he's doing this, they brought in a team from Germany that had a VR flight simulator. And essentially they brought it in. They're like, hey, can we make this like a football thing where he can like run through virtual reps that let him feel the speed of plays? And they made it happen. And he said, I believe it was quoted that like it basically changed the game for him. And it allowed him to see the game faster. And essentially, I guess you could say it worked out. He ended up winning the Heisman, and now he's going to be a top 5 pick in the draft. So it's amazing that, like you said, if he doesn't even get to LSU, right, who knows where his career could be.
So let's move away from the quarterbacks for a bit. Charles, I want you to go into the memory banks of the guys in this year's draft. When you were watching these guys in high school, who was your favorite? Just when you popped on that tape, you're like, oh my God, I just love this guy.
Man, that's tough.
Dude, man, that's a loaded one, Charles.
You
got to dig deep in there.
I would say strictly going off tape, like Brock Bowers was one for sure. I think anytime you go with a tight end being a 5-star and you don't really know for sure like how big he is, like there's like always questions there, but he was one that when we just put him at the back of the 5 stars, I was like, I'm willing to bet on this guy's athleticism and just his ability to be a mismatch. So he was one for sure. I just was really, really high on him. And I think when you go back and look at like the testing numbers he was putting up, I think he ran a 4.55 and had a 40-inch vertical as a rising junior, 1,000-yard receiver, played all over the field, kind of like what you see from like a modern tight end prospect when they're coming out of high school, basketball player. So he was one. Man, there are so many.
Well, can I ask a question about Bowers? Because I'm curious. Because one of the things I'm always fascinated with in terms of evaluating guys out of high school is determining their level of competition. So Brock Bowers is from Napa, California, like wine country. That's not where we expect to find a lot of football players. So how do you gauge what you're watching on the video with, when you got a guy who plays in Houston or a guy who plays in Miami or Atlanta, where you have a lot better idea of what they're playing against?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And so I think starting off, you want to see a guy who you're kind of projecting as a blue chip national type of prospect to dominate the competition, kind of that would be like requisite to where he's playing. So he's not playing top competition in Napa, but I also think it's important too. Like Napa High School when he got there was terrible. Like I think they didn't win a single game his sophomore year, so he kind of helped them. So I think relative to who they were playing, they probably were on the lower end. But also too, I think that's the use of like the neutral settings, right? So that's seeing them in camps, verifying the athleticism. Seeing them in these like all-star type of situations. And Brock Bowers was a guy that we didn't get to see like anybody else in this cycle. There were no national all-star games. So I remember going back and trying to find, I was watching like a workout video of him just to see like, okay, how was he moving around? He was like running against guys in one-on-ones just in a random field. So the 2021 cycle was one where you were looking for anything you could find on these guys. Hopefully we wanted to do that again, but yeah, I think you just came away knowing like this guy's kind of freaky athletically, and just the fact that he was lining up playing receiver, he's playing running back, kind of everything he was doing at Georgia, he was doing in high school. So like thankfully there wasn't like a ton of like a crazy projection there. But he was one definitely that we liked. I think one has a shot of being the first running back in this draft. I really like Jonathon Brooks coming out of high school. I think we were the only ones that had him, in their like ranking. I think he was like 105 for us. But I remember his senior. So he was a Tom Herman commit, which I'll say Tom Herman, his staff did a great job with running backs. They signed like Bijan Robinson, who everybody has as a 5-star, but Jonathon Brooks had like a similar profile to Bijan coming out of high school. Just kind of a smaller school, but just dominant high school running back. I think he ran for like over 60 touchdowns, 14 yards a carry his senior year. But I remember watching that state championship game, and like he broke so many tackles. It was maybe like the gutsiest performance I've ever seen from like a high school player. They lost like at the last second, I think, on a goal line stand, but he was like literally, I tweeted out a video of this, but he was like carrying defenders on his back. I think he was played both ways, never came off the field. So he was one that I just felt like really good about, just being like a very good college football player. And he got his opportunity this year. And I think he has a good shot of being the first running back taken. And if he doesn't tear his ACL, will probably be would have been a higher pick.
So Cody, during this time when these guys are in high school, you're either working at Texas A&M or Baylor and in the personnel departments. What were some of the guys that we're talking about in this draft that the coaching staffs you were working for were like, we have to get this, like we cannot miss on this guy?
Yeah, the one that it's borderline triggering, Andy. It's Byron Murphy. And so it's borderline the exact opposite of kind of what Charles was talking about, right? Where Brock Bowers from Napa, you kind of know he's playing. Hey, Byron Murphy's playing a bunch of ass kickers. I promise. In Dallas, he's playing a bunch of dudes. So when we were at Baylor, this is one we were super in it for. Like, we had him committed to us during the summer prior to his senior season. And, we make it through summer, we make it through the majority of the season. And there was one school that if that Austin area code came up, we were screwed, because we felt that Austin was one of those with Bo Davis, right? Bo Davis is there. He's got a great track record. University of Texas, right? It's a blue blood. And it was a matter of, if Bo Davis wanted that guy, it was over. And sure enough, in late November, we get a phone call from Byron, and he calls us to say, hey guys, really respect what you guys are doing, what you guys are building here. I'm going to go ahead and decommit, and I'm going to go on a visit to Texas because I want to be respectful to you. And kudos to the kid, right? There's a lot of ways prospects go about this business, right? And he handled it perfectly. He gives us a call. He showed respect. He let us know that he believed in what we were doing, all that good stuff. But he told us, he goes, hey, I'm decommitting. And just so you know, I'm going on a visit to Texas. And we're like, all right, guys, what's the timer? 24 hours, 48 hours until this pops? And sure enough, it was the same day Byron flipped to Texas. And that was the one that we knew. And it's tough, right? Because Byron, you even look at it from a measurables perspective. Byron doesn't fit the prototypical mold for a first-round defensive tackle, right? This is a guy that's sniffing 6'1". He's 300 pounds, but he's strong as an ox. Like, he's a fire hydrant, and you will not move him. He plays low to the ground. He plays with crazy leverage. It was one of those at Baylor where we felt like, oh, we can get away with this one, right? Like, this is someone that maybe the big boys aren't necessarily going after. And when Texas made the call, we had to give them a tip of the cap, right? Because they felt that this was someone that they could plug in and have a role for. And sure enough, he was dominant at every year he played at the college level, and it's looking like he's going to be a day one pick.
Well, and that's the thing. It's interesting you mentioned that, because you're seeing him projected to be, in some cases, a top 10 pick, but definitely a top 20 pick. Right. And you mentioned he doesn't necessarily have the measurables. He does have the twitchiness, like an unusual amount of twitchiness for a big guy. And maybe the NFL is coming around on these things, like, this may be more important than this.
Right. It's tough. Me and Charles, and for us, Charles and I have a really tough gig in that perspective, because I mentioned to you before we even started, Andy, I think Louis Riddick put out a tweet or something a couple months ago where he's talking about it's becoming tougher and tougher for NFL teams and departments to project how these college athletes are going to play at the NFL level, because the game is changing, right? The game's always evolving, and you never know how these NFL guys are actually going to look in 3 or 4 years or 5 years because the NFL is changing. Well, it's even tougher for us as we project for the NFL draft. We have to do it 4 or 5 years prior to NFL teams doing it. And so for us, it's something that we talk about all the time. Charles and I are on the phone constantly, basically saying, hey, what's the next thing that's happening? What's the next thing that's going to change? And right now, to your point, Andy, the defensive tackles are maybe getting a little shorter, right? You're seeing a like 6'1", 6'2" guys get drafted. However, arm length is still king, right? Because even if you are shorter, you still have to win the battle of leverage. And that's about getting your hands on guys first, right? But to your point, Andy, it's the twitch. It's the athleticism. That is mattering more and more to these NFL teams. And that's always going to win out at the college level and the NFL level.
So, Charles, I want to ask you about this offensive tackle class in this draft, because you've written about how the crop of 2025 guys, that this is potentially shaping up to be a historic recruiting class for the offensive line from the high school to college level. They're saying the same thing about that at the NFL level for this offensive line class in this draft. Like Joe Alt, when you see Joe Alt in high school, is it the same thing as these NFL guys when they see him? They're like, all right, that's everything we want. We'll take him.
No, it was not.
No. Wow.
We had Joe Alt. I think we ended up having Joe Alt ranked the highest, but Joe Alt was a projection. I mean, there's no doubt about it. I mean, this is a guy who, as a junior, he was 230 pounds. So you're looking at the frame. He was a blocking tight end. He played limited reps of offensive line in high school. So he was a big projection. Now, when I was watching the film with him, like I remember thinking at the time, Notre Dame signed a really good offensive line class that year, like very highly rated. It was like Joe Alt, Blake Fisher, Rocco Spindler was considered a national recruit. And I remember thinking, like, if Joe Alt pans out, he's got the highest upside of all these guys. And I think what was the most surprising thing about it wasn't surprising to me that he ended up becoming a first-round pick, just because you knew the pedigree, you knew the upside. Like, I think that upside was always apparent. What was surprising to me is that Joe Alt got on the field as a freshman and just like was the guy. Like Blake Fisher got hurt. They put Joe Alt in like mid-season, and he was just like it was like a freshman All-American, and it became like the best offensive tackle in college football the next few years. So how quickly he picked it up was what was surprising to me. But no, I mean, I would be lying if I said that Joe Alt did not require a bunch of projection out of high school. But like Cody and I talk about this all the time. Like, we're in a game of projection, and you have like there is an inclination with often like college coaches to take the ready-made guy. But I think unless you're projecting a offensive lineman to get on the field like day one, these guys catch up real fast. And I think Joe Alt's a great example of that. I mean, he was 300 pounds, very quickly and was able to adapt, really having not played offensive line before. So if you want to have fun, go back and look up pictures of Joe Alt as a recruit, and you will be stunned that this is a top 10 pick as an offensive tackle, because he is all of 230, 240 pounds.
But the thing is, if you look at Joe Alt now, like if you watch him walking towards you, if he's not standing next to somebody else, you don't realize how big he is, because he has the dimensions of a smaller person, but in that massive frame. So it feels like you take the best athlete who has the frame that looks like they can carry the weight, which brings me to a question for Cody, because there's another offensive tackle that his name's being kicked around as a potential first rounder, could be early second round. We'll see. But he's viewed as more of a project in the NFL because he hasn't played offensive line that long. Tyler Guyton. Now, he's from Manor, Texas. So he was a guy that I'm sure crossed your desk a few times when he was in high school. He's considered like an absolute athletic freak show as an offensive tackle. But when he was in high school, did you guys imagine that, him being that in 5 years?
No. The short answer is no, right? But there are certain guys where you're sort of playing the game, right? Charles nailed it correctly. It's a game of projection, right? So for us, the projection was, okay, the athlete was there, right? The athleticism's there. The size is there. But the traits and the rawness at the position, you're sort of playing the game. And to Charles' point, you're basically playing the game of boom or bust. And for us, when I was I believe he was a 21 cycle guy. Was he a 21 cycle?
He was 2020.
He was
2020. So
signed with
TCU
in 2020.
So I was at Texas A&M at the time. And for us, the bar for us was a little higher than compared to Baylor in terms of guys that you're willing to take a risk on. So for a guy like Tyler Guyton, for us on the high school film, for us, it was a matter of, okay, athletically and physically, we believe he's there. How long, positionally wise, right? We have to clean him up. We have to polish him. We felt he was a little too raw for our taste in order to see him see the field early enough for us. Right. Mm-hmm. So for us at A&M, it was a matter of, okay, how many years before this guy sees the field? And for what we had in our room, we felt like it was a matter of this guy won't see the field for us until year 3, maybe year 4. And for us, that's too long to bet on a player to come in and hopefully shine. And basically, it was a matter of stacking the board. And for us at Texas A&M, he wasn't necessarily high enough, but that's the game these teams are playing. They're saying, okay, when can I get this guy on the field? When is he going to reach that ceiling that we do believe he has, right? Because like you said, size-wise and athletic-wise, he was there. But positionally, it was a matter of when can this guy step on the field for us? And for some programs, that's 3 years down the line. For some programs, that's year 1. You don't know until that guy steps on campus. But for us, it was a matter of projecting and saying, okay, when is this guy on the field for us? At A&M, it was too long for our taste.
Well, and so I want to ask both of you guys, this is another example of this, but was Gary Patterson the best projector in the history of the world?
Going. Yeah, me and Charles literally had this call
yesterday. 2024, we still have Gary Patterson fines getting taken in the first round, but it was like Kendre Miller. I mean, Kendre Miller was a guy who I think they beat out UTSA for him. But Tyler Guyton, I remember when they signed Tyler Guyton, and you see, okay, like this guy's like 6'7", he's played football for like 2 years. Defensive lineman that they're projecting probably going to grow him into an offensive tackle.
Yep.
Gary Patterson was ahead of the curve just with projecting. I mean, that was, Andy, you think back to those defenses that he had in the mid 2000s, like the Jerry Hughes, I think is the classic. Yeah. Well, it's like high school running back. They grow him into a defensive end, but he was always bulking guys up and moving them down. So his teams are super fast, but they started doing that at every position. That was one where, I think Gary Patterson had the reputation where, Cody, I guess you can speak to this a lot better than me, but when he would offer a guy like in Texas, everyone is going to check to make sure we need to look at here.
I kid you not. I was going to say when you're against TCU in the recruiting world, if they offer a guy, you watch it again. That's just how it goes.
If what am I missing here? Yeah.
What is he seeing that we're not? And it was something about that defense, especially on the defensive side, right? Where you would say, okay, this is just a Gary Patterson player. It's that tweener edge that now you see across college football at every level. It's Harold Perkins at LSU. It's Will Anderson at Alabama. It's all these guys that you're like, oh, he's not big enough to play like a hand in the dirt end, but is he athletic enough to play like off-ball linebacker? Gary Patterson says, why not both? Just let him do both. And those guys end up being phenomenal players, but he does that, to Charles's point, he does that at every level of the field, and he does it on both sides of the ball. D. Winters is another guy that played safety and receiver, and he bulks him up and he goes, well, he's the best athlete on the field. Just put a little weight on him and let him play linebacker. And boom, he goes and has multiple on-conference seasons and becomes an All-American. The thing that Gary Patterson was able to do is exactly what we're doing now. And it was his ability to project athleticism and how guys can maintain that athletic ability while putting weight on. And Tyler Guyton is a textbook example of that.
So I'm going to ask both of you guys this question, and it can be somebody who's playing in college football now or someone who may be washed out, but we'll start with Charles. Who did you think would be getting drafted probably first round this year who isn't in the draft at all? Either they're still playing or they're not playing football anymore.
Oh, that is a.
Thank you for asking Charles first, because I get time to sit on it.
I think if you look at if you look at the kind of industry rankings for 21, I think you look at guys like, like Tommy Brockermeyer was one who I think
offensive lineman from Texas, went to Alabama.
Yeah. So this cycle nationally, the 2021, the 3 and out cycle we're talking about was heavy offensive line. And I think if we're going to compare the current cycle, 2025, which I think is probably the best I've seen to this point, to a recent one, 21 would be the best kind of parallel. And most of these guys we've kind of seen in this draft, but I would say like Tommy Brockermeyer is one who I think he's like a backup at TCU. He's one that was kind of in that group with your, with your Amarius Mims, Kingsley Sumataya, JC Latham. He was considered a peer of those guys. And so I would say him. I think some of the Ohio State guys who came back for a 4th year, I would have expected them to go in the draft.
JT Tuimoloau, Jack Sawyer. Yeah.
Donovan Jackson was another one who was like a 5-star offensive lineman.
Mm-hmm.
So I wasn't quite as high on like a JT Tuimoloau, but certainly a 5-star prospect. Jack Sawyer for sure. Corey Foreman, I think when you look back at that cycle, is one who was just really, he's probably the answer. I would say. But there were some signs of Corey Foreman. In high school, he wasn't super productive. Didn't play his senior year, so I think there's certainly extenuating circumstances with that cycle that one made it difficult for guys, maybe not ideal for them developing, but also difficult to evaluate. So it's kind of both, where neither circumstance were favorable, I would say.
And Corey Foreman was at USC for 3 seasons. He's going to play at Fresno State this year. So he's not done yet, but he's not obviously lived up to the hype surrounding his recruitment. But Cody, who do you have?
Yeah, there's 2 for me. One is Xavier Saray. I remember when Xavier Saray was coming out, I think it was at LSU at the time, even as like a student, when he really popped up on the recruiting scene, because he was a younger guy that was always built. He was like 6'1", 215, played running back, played safety, played receiver, did everything, and was physical and violent. And then, I went to my next stop at A&M. Oh, cool. He's 6'1", 215, runs well, violent. All right, cool. Next season, still 6'1", 215, runs well, violent. He was like really like my first example of, okay, you got to understand guys' growth potential and their ability to project and like add on weight and be able to move at the next level. Because Xavier Saray has looked like the exact same guy since he was like a sophomore in high school. And he was one of my first real lessons of like, okay, you really got to understand how size and athleticism works in relation to age, and when these guys get to the next level, how can they stack weight and maintain athletic ability? Because Xavier Saray has not panned out to the degree that I thought he was. I think
played 3 years at Georgia. He'll probably start at Arkansas this year. Yeah,
sure. And you're like, okay, but he was never. I think he was top 40 for you guys whenever you were ranking, maybe, Charles, but. That was always a guy where I was like, oh my gosh, I remember him coming out and I was like, man, I remember when he got like that first offer and everybody was like, this guy's going to be a freak. He's going to be the next guy.
I think he was kind of in the 5-star track. And for us, he dropped a little bit. But Cody, I think you bring up a great point. And that's one of the larger trends that I think that I've noticed in this draft in particular, but I think it applies for everything. And that's one thing where, when Cody and I are working on these high school rankings, we look at age, and I think when you are in, I think it's really important when you're looking at, we're starting to evaluate these guys when they're getting offers as like 15-year-olds, a 6-month difference, or in some cases a year difference.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're looking at a 10th grader is pretty significant. And what we found just from looking at the draft, these guys with younger, kind of like later birthdays for the cycle, they catch up senior year, freshman year of college. And I think when you look at this draft, there is an inordinate amount of late birthday guys. And there's very, very few guys who are held back, like very few. And the number of late birth, I would say there's more guys who are in the wrong class on the young side, significantly more than ones who were held back. Like you look at
an idea of why that might have happened.
Janu was 17 years old. He should have been a 2021 prospect. There's countless, but it's, it's very interesting when you look at that, and it catches up for sure.
NIL was coming, and it got you in there faster. It got you in that pipeline faster.
Yeah, I don't like, it's a lot of the situations are kind of different, and like I'm personally not a huge proponent of reclassifying. I think when you look at the hit rate there, it's probably, once the dust settles on that, it's probably not going to be great. But I do think just there is something to be said for just like physical maturation happening later, just because you're a little behind as you know, like a 10th grader. Like I've been like reading up on these guys. Like I was reading Dane Brugler's scouting reports in the Beast, and he had like Ladd McConkey was 5'6", like 120 or 130 as like a sophomore. You know, it's like these guys come in every shape and size, but eventually, you know, once they get to college, it's all gonna kind of even out, especially once you get in that college strength program and you're eating, you know, 3 meals a day and eating at the training table and trying to put weight on. You can always kind of catch up if you have the frame to hold it.
Well, just to add on to Charles' thing, it's funny projecting these guys to the next level too, right? Because there's some people like Joe Alt, for instance. Charles smokes that, right? This is somebody that you're saying, hey, I've seen him. I know the way he moves around. If you throw 50, 60 pounds on this guy, I know what he's going to look like because the movement skills are too good, whatever. Then you have guys like Tavondre Sweat, who I want to say confidently no one was like, oh yeah, he's going to throw 100 pounds on. He's going to be a dominant nose tackle. Like there's opposite ends of the spectrum. There's no way.
You usually don't expect anyone to play at 360 and be effective.
Correct.
But
exactly. Exactly. And that kid was 260 playing defensive end in high school. So there's nobody that looked at that frame and said, ooh, let's throw 100 pounds on this and see what happens. Like that just doesn't happen. So I just wanted to add on to that. But my second player is, to this day, the freakiest athlete I have ever seen with my own eyeballs, and it was Damon Demas. That was my other one, right? Damon Demas. He has off-field stuff that, you know, obviously inhibits his career, but it's one of my favorite stories that I have from my times with teams. So we're at Texas A&M summer camp, and he was committed to Texas A&M at this point. So he's committed, and he shows up to summer camp, but he doesn't compete, right? He's riding around with Jimbo Fisher in the golf cart. He's watching all these guys do one-on-ones and all this good stuff. And there's a kid who is Teddy Knox, who is at SMU, I think. And Teddy is a burner. Like this guy can run. So he comes, and Jimbo Fisher does things differently at camp. When you go to Jimbo Fisher summer camp, you do all your testing after the workout's over. So you go through one-on-ones, and it's like, all right, cool. Let's go do the vertical. Let's go do the broad jump. Let's go do all the 40s in testing. So Teddy Knox goes and runs 4.44 on his first run after camp. And everybody's like, ooh, and like, oh my gosh, this is crazy. And then on his second run, he touches 4.40. And everybody like loses it, right? Everybody's losing their minds. Damon's there. Everybody sees it. And everybody goes, oh my gosh, Teddy Knox might be the fastest kid at camp. There's no way anybody's running faster than that. And Damon says, let me go grab my cleats. And so he goes to his car, grabs his spikes, and is putting them on like out like next to the track. And everybody's like, Damon, you don't have to run, dude. Like you haven't done anything all day. You're cold. Like, what are you doing? And he tells the coach that goes and talks to him, he goes, when I see the field, I'm warm. And we're like, what the hell? Like, and so he goes and runs 6 watches, all of them under 4.4. The fastest said 4.37, and then he leaves. He goes home, runs 4.37 cold. And everybody's like, okay, well, that's not normal at all. So that's by far the freakiest cat I've ever seen. Off-field stuff to turn.
Well, and I remember all the videos that would come when he was in high school of him catching while flipping and doing all this crazy backflip stuff.
Yep.
And yeah, he washed out at A&M. He was a JUCO guy in Kansas. I think was supposed to visit Nebraska at one point this offseason, but never did. So
yeah,
that happens sometimes. Exactly.
And that's the game you're playing. Sometimes the guys that you feel are surefire don't pan out. And then guys at the end of the cycle, like I remember when I was at LSU, we took DJ Chark. And DJ Chark was the last take in that LSU class, like literally the last guy we took. And I remember talking to DJ. He was always a super nice kid. And so he kind of came into our office and we're like, DJ, I hope I'm not getting DJ in trouble. But we were like, DJ, what made you come to LSU? And he was like, well, I was going to go to Oklahoma State. And then LSU called my mom. And my mom was like, hey, son, you're going to LSU. And DJ Chark's like, why am I going to LSU? And she goes, well, they said they'll pay for your braces. And so that's why he ended up going to LSU, because his mom was like, hey, they said they're going to take care of your braces. You're going to stay home and play for LSU.
Listen,
done deal.
One of the greatest Simpsons episodes ever, when Homer becomes the Union chief.
Yes.
Dental plan. Lisa needs braces. Dental plan. Lisa needs braces. So listen, hey, I just got done paying the orthodontist for 2 kids. So
sure.
Yeah.
God bless Miss Shark.
No doubt.
I know where she's at. So, well, and that's probably a great place. Great place to end it, guys. This was awesome. I think if you're a recruiting nerd, you had a lot of fun today. We're going to make this an annual tradition. I can tell you that right now. But I can't wait to watch the draft, and maybe we'll come back next week after the draft and see how we feel about how everybody did and where some of these guys went. But thank you so much, gentlemen.
Of course.
Thanks, Andy. Appreciate you, man, as always.
Charles Power and Cody Bellaire. That was so much fun. And yeah, we're definitely going to make it an annual tradition. But we got a lot more to talk about this week with the draft. My mock draft is coming out later today. We're going to discuss it on the show tomorrow with On3 national writer Jesse Simonson. We're also going to discuss his top 25 college coaches list, which I'm sure will not produce any arguments whatsoever in the chat. Oh, wait, no. You guys are going to go crazy arguing in the chat over that. And Jesse and I may argue a little bit. That's the thing. He can yell at me about my mock draft. I can yell at him about his coach rankings. That's how you make a show, ladies and gentlemen. Got to have a little friction there. We can't agree on everything. But it'll be fun. We'll be talking about all of that tomorrow. Cannot wait. We'll talk to you in the morning.